The Narendra Modi government used its fourth budget to very briefly go beyond matters of the fisc, expenditure, taxes, and put some light on the matter of political funding in this country, how parties operate, how people win elections. I have with me today somebody who's well placed to talk about this. Milan Vaishnav of the Carnegie Endowment has written a book that's just come out titled When Crime Pays. It's about the money and muscle that goes into Indian politics. Milan, thank you very much for joining us. Let's start with this whole debate that the budget has triggered. They've lowered cash contributions and they've introduced the concept of electoral bonds. Do you think this does much to move towards a more transparent political system?
So I think what they've done is pretty minor in the larger scope of things. I mean, we're talking about pretty small baby steps. A couple of things. One is they brought down the cash limit from 20,000 to 2,000. Interestingly, what's not in the finance bill, although what was in Jaitley's speech and his subsequent comments, is that the disclosure requirement would also be moved from 20,000 to 2,000. That actually hasn't changed. That remains the same. The second big ticket item was this idea of electoral bonds, which is, fairly simple. If I'm a corporate and I want to give to a political party, I can go to a bank, take out a bond for, say, 5 crores. I don't have to make that disclosure public. The bank has a record of that transaction. Then I go to a political party, I deposit those bonds worth 5 crore into their bank account. Now the party knows that I, the corporate, have given them that money.
Do they keep a record of it?
They keep a record of it, but they're not required to disclose it to
the Election
anybody.
Commission asks them to keep a record of it, or are they saying if you want to, you can for your own record?
Yeah, that's a little bit unclear. What we do know is that no one is going to ask them for it, because the whole idea is political parties, corporates would prefer this transaction be anonymous, and this basically allows them to do so, except it allows them to do so using the banking system rather than under the table.
That was what came out as criticism right after the measure, right? People said, well, people were doing this under the table, but there was a table for it to do under. Right now what you're doing is you're creating a veil where the public, you have the regulator of the banking system that knows, you might have the Election Commission that knows, but the public at large, if these bonds are sent in to parties, does not know who's giving money to whom. Is that fair criticism?
It's hugely fair criticism. I mean, this is giving legitimacy to an opaque system that everyone understands is suboptimal. And basically what you're doing is you're giving the state's imprimatur, that's good housekeeping seal of approval on this kind of a deal. And, the public, civil society, the media, they would not be able to follow a single rupee in this money trail. So I think it's a disaster when it comes to public transparency. It is problematic when the state itself is giving backing to this kind of thing, because in the previous system, when you had to disclose amounts that were above 20,000 rupees, now many people chose not to disclose, but some did. Now even that will arguably be lost because everyone will just go the bond route, and it's perfectly acceptable to be opaque about it.
There's a part where he also mentioned the 2008 Obama campaign in the United States. And there was part of where he said you had small donations coming in by the millions, and that funded much of that campaign. But you also, in the post-2010 environment in the US, have the problem of mega donors being able to use vehicles to fund politics in America. Explain how perhaps, while Jaitley mentioned the United States, that may not at all be the right model to follow.
Yeah, I mean, I think, the one good thing you could say about how America has funded elections up until the recent past was, yes, there was a torrent of money, but by and large, you could track it. There was a system of disclosure, of transparency that, it was still hard to prove quid pro quos, but like an investigative journalist, people who are really dogged to try to put together the pieces. Now we've moved away from that in the United States. We've had Citizens United, we've had the dawn of super PACs, and so in fact we're regressing. And so, one of the things which in my interaction with government officials they've said is, look, what we're trying to do with electoral bonds is, it's not all that different from super PACs.
Right.
Now, my response would be that's not something to aspire to. I mean, we're those of us who believe in democracy and governance, transparency in the United States are cursing the Supreme Court for having made this judgment.
I'm going to quote from something you've written. You say many voters vote for politicians because, rather than in spite of their criminal reputation. And then in another part, in a connected point, you say a third way suspected criminal politicians signal credibility is their ability to cushion economic shocks by doling out handouts from their own coffers and providing patronage. Are you suggesting that there are and there remain parts of this country where the state frequently fails and then strongmen step in to provide that social net and that safety net and perhaps even deliver justice at times?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are many parts of this country, not only in the parts where we might expect, which are the Hindi belt states, the relatively poorer states, the Bimaru, so-called Bimaru states, where the state is not able to effectively or impartially carry out, what you think of as its core sovereign functions: law and order, justice, welfare redistribution, social insurance. And so therefore, in the absence of those things, you create a vacuum whereby it's quite rational, quite logical for a voter to seek the help, to seek the support of a strong man who's willing to mediate that relationship between the citizen and the state. And so, by doing that, they're essentially, filling in for the governance which doesn't exist. And so voters know, often to quite a granular level of detail, what the criminal reputations of these people are.
So this is in no way an ignorant voter.
This is not an ignorant voter. It's a very shrewd voter, but they believe that your willingness and ability to run afoul of the law, to bend rules, to do whatever it takes by hook or by crook is something which, in the end of the day, is going to provide some semblance of protection.
You argue that just switching to a public model for funding political parties won't work. Why do you say that?
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm in favor of public funding in theory, but public funding under the current conditions is not going to work,
right,
because every single party will just take white money from the government and they'll continue on with their black money or their private money shenanigans. So the point is, if you want to introduce some system of public money, that has to be linked to strong requirements of transparency, of disclosure, and penalty. If you flout the law, if you don't submit your statements on time, if you don't have independently audited accounts, then you are at risk of losing whatever public funding may come online. So you have to somehow strike a grand bargain between the government and between the political parties for this to work. And I think, rushing towards a system where we're going to bring in public money now is not going to solve these problems and it'll arguably make them worse.
Milan, thank you very much for making time.
Thanks a lot.